Welcome to a wonderful, peaceful morning somewhere in the state of Pirtunian. Most people in the West have never heard of this country or its hybrid war struggle against the TDPM, a separatist faction sponsored by its aggressive neighbour Donovia. Recently, the Donovians have stepped up support for their proxies who embarked on a major offensive. As you may have guessed, this wonderful, peaceful morning is not going to stay wonderful and peaceful for long. Especially not when someone is throwing 300mm BM-30 rockets about. This is the third mission of UK Fight Club's Operation Balaclava, an introductory campaign showcasing peer capabilities using both the Dynamic Action Training Environment and Combat Mission Professional Edition. I'm not particularly going to go into the details of CM Pro here. There are some new elements to the game that I certainly hope will make it into the commercial edition at some point, but those are something for another time. In this mission, I'm in command of a blue, technically green, reinforced company holding the front line where it runs through this rapidly disappearing village. Off to the west, the red main effort has been stopped dead by a combined German-Pirtunian force, which has led the TPDM to switch its focus and send a battalion tactical group my way. On the one hand, this means that I'm outnumbered at least 3 to 1. On the other hand, the enemy is attacking on a very narrow front, only about 1300 metres, with limited open ground to manoeuvre and mass its firepower, so they are going to offer a target-rich environment and be very vulnerable to artillery. The balance of power is clearly in Red's favour though, and the briefing explicitly states that my force is going to suffer heavy casualties. Luckily, I can do my job without living all the way to the end of the battle. Off to the east, there is a UK force moving to counterattack. It's about 45 minutes away, which means my mission is to fix the enemy in place for that counterattack to land. Simple. Unfortunately, I'm playing this in single player, and the AI in combat mission cannot be intimidated, it cannot be encouraged to stop and reorientate, and it cannot be dilemmaed into hesitation or inaction like a human opponent can be if you're lucky. The AI has a plan set out by the scenario designer and will attempt to carry it out. AI-controlled units will only stop if physically destroyed or reduced to a state of uncontrollable panic. In other words, the only way I'm actually going to be able to fix Red forces here is by inflicting maximum damage. Exactly how I'm going to do this comes down to the ground that we're fighting over. Terrain is destiny in war. The enemy is approaching from the north into a U or V of open ground created by a northwest to southeast linear village and a large forest in the east. This makes a good looking fire sack. If the enemy moves into the central fields, then I can hit him from both sides with flanking fire. That naturally leaves my flanks open, but again I'm counting on the terrain to help me out. On my left, the suburban terrain with its buildings and gardens will force the enemy to slow down and give me time to direct artillery on him. On the right, I can expect the forest to delay the enemy in a similar way, except where the north-south forest road cuts through it, but the combination of the narrow passage and a curve in the road gives me the opportunity to set up a close-range ambush there. So the plan in a nutshell is to destroy the enemy in a central fire sack, anchored on the flanks by terrain, artillery and an ambush. To get this done, I've set up 2 of my BMP-2 platoons and my 2 tanks, a pair of T-64 Bulats, in the western half of the village covering the centre fields. My remaining BMP-2 platoon and my attached engineers are set up on the edge of the forest in the east to run the ambush and add some crossfire to the fire sack. I have an additional attached recce platoon in BTR-4Es, which I'm holding back in the woods behind the village centre as my reserve. Just behind them is an MTLB with my company HQ and an attached FO crammed into it. I want the FO and the HQ to be in the same place so they can talk to each other. Supplementing the defence, I've got a load of wire and mixed mines. I've set the wire up in between the train station and Farmstead 2, where it will hopefully slow down any Red advance through that gap and give me time to hit them with artillery or flanking fire. Most of the rest of the mines carry on this line on the other side of the farmstead running to the centre copse. This is an avenue of approach that my deployment doesn't cover as well as I would like, hence beefing it up with the mines. The rest of them are set up on the roads either side of the train station, on the road running to Farmstead 2, and on the forest road to complement the ambush. The battle opens with a huge preparatory bombardment from Red, featuring the aforementioned BM-30s. Luckily, I've managed to deploy my forces away from those insane cluster patterns, and while Red has other missions going, because they're all spread across different targets, they really lack the concentration of fire to be effective against my dispersed forces. As the bombardment is going in, Red forces start to move up. In particular, some T-72s and BMPs roll up to the triangular wood in the north, starting to engage in prophylactic area fire on the village and dismounting troops, respectively. This is a position I'd anticipated Red might use. It's a chunk of dominant high ground that would make a good fire position, so I left a target reference point on it. Unlike Red, I'm concentrating my artillery in this battle. I have 6 120mm mortars with high explosive and 12 152mm howitzers on call, half with high explosive and half with DPICM. I'm concentrating it not just because I want to use it like the finger of God to obliterate anything I choose, but because I have a single highly trained forward observer, and it's going to be much more efficient to use him to adjust everything at once than it's going to be to farm out missions to multiple callers. Kicking the combined fire mission off on medium intensity and maximum duration, the Red BMPs and infantry at Triangle Wood are quickly destroyed in a hail of indirect fire. At about the same time, Red also sends a motor rifle platoon down the forest road. One of the BMPs catches some 30mm cannon fire from my forces across the fire sack, losing a couple of passengers and dropping back, leaving the other two to run into the ambush. Both of these avoid the mines in the middle of the road, but the first BMP pulls up across from the engineers and is destroyed by an RPG-7. The second BMP is passing just next to the engineers as they reload, but takes a volley of RPG-26s from one of my infantry teams on the other side. It quickly burns, and the survivors are gunned down as they bail out. The final BMP, the one that was hit earlier, rolls up a few seconds later, hitting a mine that causes it to slam the brakes on in full view of the engineer's now reloaded RPG-7, with fatal consequences. The only survivor of the entire platoon is the platoon leader, who runs off in an understandable panic. That's one Red motor rifle platoon destroyed inside the first minutes, plus 2/3 of what is actually their grenade launcher platoon setting up on the Triangle Wood, and, the cherry on top, a T-72B3 on the right, which is taken out by an AP-FSDS round from one of the Bulats. It's not all good news though. One of the features of Combat Mission Professional is the ability to create replays of battles in which you can see both sides' perspective. While I'm getting optimistic on the right, Red has moved an entire company, a third of his entire force, to a line on Farmstead 1, where he has already dismounted his infantry in preparation for an attack on the train station and village west. I have an impression that something is there, but this is the least well covered section of my defence. In theory, my BMPs over on the right can just about see across the centre and offer some support, but I've started off with them under tree cover and turret down to avoid exposure to drones and possible enemy aircraft. Even if they were in position, Red has dropped a smoke screen between the train station and Farmstead 2 that would block their line of sight. I'm soon distracted from this budding threat in any case. Red is bringing its second company up into the centre. This is the company the lost motor rifle platoon and T-72 belong to, and it has an equally bad time as it runs into the fire sack. One platoon comes under fire from my left as it enters the wheat field, quickly losing 2 vehicles to a T-64, and the third to my company commander's BMP, which I'm using as an outpost vehicle under the centre copse. Blasting away with its 30mm cannon, the commander's BMP knocks the AT-5 off the turret of a 4th Red BMP as it goes past. This is from 2nd Company's final motor rifle platoon, and it makes the atrocious decision to stop in the field just ahead and dismount its infantry, allowing my BMP to shoot directly into the open troop compartments as the passengers try and get out. The other two enemy vehicles in this platoon also stop to disgorge their infantry. One manages to do so in relative safety behind the centre copse supported by a T-72, while the other, somewhat incredibly, manages to stop in the minefield. It doesn't actually hit any mines, but the infantry piling out the back do and suffer a casualty. I'm not too bothered about this. Certainly not bothered enough to redirect my artillery, especially when I've now noticed Red's developing company attack on the train station. My first real indicator that this is going to be a problem comes as enemy infantry and BMPs make their way towards Farmstead 2. They take a few casualties to 30mm cannon fire from behind the train station itself, and one of the Red vehicles finds an AT mine on the road just before my readjusted artillery starts falling on them, courtesy of the target reference point of the farmstead. 120mm bombs start falling first, pinning and then steadily shredding Red's dismounts even before the slower adjusting DPICM joins in. By the time that's falling though, it's game over at the train station. This was basically defended by a single split squad and a TRP, so once the first Red BMP rolled up and got lucky with the volley of RPG-26s that came its way, one going high and the other being intercepted by a convenient hedge, things went rapidly downhill. One of my teams disappeared under coax and 30mm cannon fire, the other managed to down a couple of Red's dismounts on the train tracks, but quickly took casualties in return. It's not all one way. Two of this company's 3 T-72s hit mines on the station roads and become immobilised, while my infantry in Village West destroy a BMP and cause casualties to Red's infantry as it squeezes past the wire. But it is bad news. From the train station, the enemy is poised to chew down the line of the village and roll up my positions from the flank. Luckily for me, the train station is one of Red's objectives, and the force there stops to occupy it, giving my FO time to shift my artillery. The 120mm mortars are out of ammo, but the first dose of DPICM sees 2 bomblets hit the top of an immobilised T-72 and set off a catastrophic explosion. After a little while, the hail of cluster munitions and 152mm high explosive destroys most of the station buildings and starts grinding down Red's infantry as they cower in the ruins. Meanwhile, the course of events has pivoted in the centre. This is entirely down to a single T-72B3, having been jammy enough to have trees intercept both a 125mm AP FSDS round from one of the Bulats and an AT-5 anti-tank missile from a BMP, with the added insult of destroying the BMP in revenge. This T-72 suddenly leaves the tree line it had been sat in and moves off into the centre field, blowing away my outpost BMP behind the copse as it sets off. This manoeuvre isn't something I had anticipated. I was trying to avoid a head-on engagement like this, hence my deploying vehicles in defilated keyholes for flanking fire. Now I have to deal with an enemy main battle tank diving straight at them. In short order, the T-72 spots one of the T-64s and engages, though thankfully it misses with its first shot. The T-64 spots its opponent via muzzle flash, but chooses to return fire with an AT-11 combat barrel-launched ATGM. It's accurate, but the heat warhead is absorbed by the T-72's explosive reactive armour. It did manage to severely damage the target's tracks though, which are disabled a second later by an RPG from half the HQ team that I'd stashed in the copse with the BMP. Unfortunately, this doesn't faze the Red tank in the slightest, and it proceeds to destroy not only the first T-64 that it had already engaged, but then the other T-64, which was sitting there with no idea what was going on. This, at least, gave time for my outpost to reload and get another RPG off, scoring a hit that penetrates the front slope, but this only manages to kill the driver and knock out the engine. The turret crew, apparently unharmed, swiftly swivel off target and get their revenge with a 125mm high explosive shell. This was a key turning point in the battle. One extremely lucky T-72B3 effectively neutralised the entire left side of my fire sack. That's just how it pans out sometimes, though at some point I'm going to have to go back and replay that turn to see what would happen if my first T-64 had fired a fin round. Back at the train station, Red only has one platoon left up and running. This is muscling in on Village West, having gotten past the wire. My troops are giving back as good as they get, now with some flanking fire from my Forest Road position. I've finally popped up the 2 BMPs I have over there, and they account for a couple more enemy vehicles. This, combined with more 30mm cannon fire from another BMP in Village West, which is enfilading the main road in, slows Red down, but it's still a one-sided contest. The surviving mobile T-72B3 up at the train station rolls forward to assist Red's infantry, polishing off the enfilade BMP and allowing the dismounts to move in and mop up. With that done, the T-72 punches through. There is literally nothing in its way. All of my BMPs at Village West are gone, and the 2 survivors further down the line have been taken out by cluster munitions, one taking a bomblet from a 152mm cluster, and the other being singled out by an Su-25, which is orbiting the battlefield. Fortunately for me, there's a single RPG team left up opposite the train station that has escaped notice, and while the T-72 tries to figure out where to go next, it suffers a fatal hit at 200 meters. That pretty much resolves the action on the left. It looks like Red has grabbed the ground it came for, but suffered debilitating casualties in the process. While all this has been going on, however, events have been building up on the right. The Forest Road itself has been quiet, but this has allowed my forces to hear engine noises off to their right. There's a track through the forest over there that I either missed or disregarded, I can't remember, and now Red is squeezing something mechanized down it. I don't have anything covering that avenue of approach, so I have to scramble to plug it. Off goes the HQ BMP of my platoon at the Forest Road, carrying with it a fire team and the platoon HQ. These just about make it in time. Though the fire team is shot up and destroyed by machine gun fire, my BMP colanders the lead Red vehicle even as it runs over my platoon HQ, and then proceeds to wipe out a team of Red dismounts crossing the track ahead of it. This is actually the enemy company HQ. This gives me a little breathing room to rush my reserve in. The BTR-4Es crawling through the forest, getting lucky escaping another cluster bomb, but it's only one of 3 concurrent actions on the right. At the same time, my drone has spotted a T-72 loitering on the Forest Road just ahead of my ambush position. That gives me a general location for Red's 3rd tank platoon and probably his main effort on this flank. To counter this, and whatever else is around it that I can't see yet, I again start to readjust my artillery. Before it's on target though, the Su-25 pays the Forest Road a visit. This is entirely my fault. It can't see the infantry down there, but my engineers arrived in a Ural truck, and having thoroughly looted it for anti-tank weapons, I decided to park it across the road in the ambush as another obstacle to slow Red down. Now, however, the Su-25 swoops in and targets the truck with a barrage of 122mm thermobaric rockets. Thankfully, they only cause a few light casualties, but the main issue is the sheer volume of dust they throw up from the road surface. For the time being at least, the ambush is blind. Red isn't capable of seeing and reacting to events like this in the same way as a human player, and suffers a few salvos from my artillery before it moves in. 2 T-72s enter the ambush area. Neither of them hit the mines, but one does take an RPG to the side of the turret, loses its commander and weapon controls, and temporarily backs off. Its buddy plows on regardless, tanking 2 close-range RPG-26 hits on its explosive reactive armour before herring off down the road. It gets a fair way before another RPG team fires on it from the rear, taking it out. The first T-72 recovers its nerve and tries again, this time concealed in smoke. It manages to get all the way past the ambush and swings into the wood line directly behind my Forest Road position, about to take my BMPs in the rear. These are pretty much my last line of defence, along with a single BTR-4E I broke off from the reserve. With my positions on the left destroyed, the fire sack has crumbled away, and Red's freshly committed final company is storming across the centre along with the shattered remains of the company that paved its way. These new Red elements are moving up to the edge of the outer village, giving me the opportunity to enfilade them with 30mm cannon fire as I, once again, frantically readjust my artillery. The T-72 ploughing into the back of my vehicles here would seal the deal for Red, but luckily it runs over an RPG team that knocks it out at point blank range. That's a relief, but we're not exactly dealing with sunshine and rainbows here. One of my BMPs is taken out by a Red RPG, and to make matters worse, the supporting BTR-4E not only takes some damage from 30mm cannon fire as it moves up, but reflexively pops smoke which builds and blinds my surviving BMP. As a result, some Red elements cruise past my enfilading stop line and get into the village proper, dismounting troops. While this is going on, my far right descends into vicious forest fighting. My BMP on the track wipes out 2 Red BMPs before being outflanked and destroyed by an RPG hit. A third Red BMP is caught by RPG 26s and 22s as it emerges onto the forest road itself, and although for a while I think that's 3 BMPs down, the threat dealt with, there is a 4th lurking in the forest, the Red Company Commander vehicle. Luckily for me, and not the kind of break I would ever expect from a human opponent, Red's BM-30s have reloaded and start to dump more of their massive cluster warheads onto the centre village. This leads to some minor red-on-red casualties, which I'm able to multiply when my FO gets his act together and starts hammering the target himself. From here on out, the right spirals down into individual actions. There isn't any real scope for manoeuvre, just self-defense and fleeting opportunities. One of the BTR-4Es is strafed by the SU-25, a recce team hits a Red BMP with RPG-26s, more BMPs catch 30mm cannon fire, enemy artillery starts falling on the forest road, DPICM chews up Red's dismounts, and short BM-30 submunition patterns shred the edge of Red's position in the village. It's a mess, but it's a mess for both sides, with casualties and vehicle losses stacking up. After 10 minutes of chaos on the edge of the village, Red's forces in the centre have been reduced to fragments and burning wrecks, not counting an entire platoon that I missed driving into the minefield and destroying itself earlier on. Meanwhile, I start to pick up on a new enemy force approaching Farmstead 2. My surviving infantry on the left can see a mix of vehicles, BMPs, a T-72, trucks and a Tiger Jeep, even a PRP-4M artillery observation vehicle. This is obviously Red's Battalion Tactical Group HQ, and with the threat on the centre right ground down, I can't resist the opportunity to adjust my artillery onto such a high value target. Out of options, it's also almost all I can do. I'm out of the fight on the left, though some of my infantry managed to take pot shots at Red dismounts advancing into the ruins of the centre village, and I have limited options on the far right, especially when Red disengages and hooks into the village from the southeast, bypassing my forces. Fighting continues, but I'm now basically watching my artillery churn up Farmstead 2 and the BTG HQ while I wait for the clock to run down. At the 45-minute mark, the game generates a major defeat for me. This doesn't bother me very much. Sure, my force is basically out of the picture with 60 effectives remaining, 60 dead, 21 wounded, 2 knocked out tanks and 11 IFVs destroyed, plus all the ground objectives I was assigned bar 1 are either unoccupied or overrun. But in the bigger picture that combat mission scoring can't really account for, if the scheduled British counterattack comes in on time, it's going to find an immobile, fragmented and heavily attrited enemy force to kick around, which was the overall objective. In a sense, Red and I have punched each other out in this battle, leaving Red fixed for UK forces to finish off in the next mission. And Red really has suffered here. 197 dead and 72 wounded, with 5 T-72s and 30 BMPs knocked out, along with 2 drones shot down by AA missiles. The enemy's offensive capability has basically been reduced to 5 T-72s, of which only 2 are actually runners. One is detracked in a minefield, another has had its engine destroyed and its driver killed, and the last is bogged in a field, having never seen action. Even the raw red survivor count of 103 men is misleading, with most of the enemy infantry massively under strength and scattered across the map. Personally, I'd say it's mission accomplished. I could perhaps have scrounged up some more points at the end by sneaking forces into some of the ground objectives, but I was never really playing with them in mind. I was entirely enemy focused. The ground didn't have any value in and of itself, it was just where I was going to destroy the enemy. In reality though, the mutual punch-out is probably the best analogy here. The deciding factor will be what forces blue and red can commit in the aftermath, what the UK flanking force can achieve, matching up against whatever reinforcements the TPDM can throw in. That's all for this video though. I said it was going to be messy. Hope you all enjoyed it and found it informative. I'll catch you in the next one.